So that's about 30% per decade. So they were falling, not increasing. Very important point. So these amendments also created the big pharma that we see today with all the warts that it has. Between 1955 and 62, the smallest 98% of the US drug firms put out 12% of the self-originated drugs, NCEs, okay? But in the 3 years after the amendments passed, they didn't produce any new drugs at all, because all of this burden of regulation fell very heavily on them, especially the manufacturing. You know, these are small companies, and they were actually much more efficient than the bigger companies. You have to realize that. That's what the studies show. It took a lot less personnel and money to put a drug on the market for the small companies because they were more efficient. I saw this at Upjohn. Upjohn was considered a medium-sized company, but I'm like, wait a minute, this management's top heavy here. They're just not very efficient getting a drug from the lab bench to the marketplace. And of course, Upjohn was nowhere near as big as the Pfizer and the big ones are today. So anyhow, of course, not surprisingly, by 1968, a lot of these small firms have gone out of business. So the number of firms producing new chemical entities was down by 44%. So by, as you can see from this, I should have put this over here in the beginning. By 1968, only 48 firms were producing new companies instead of the 108. And part of the reason was there was a lot of merging going on, because if you have a costly FDA approval process and the FDA says, no, we don't accept your drug, then of course, what happens? You have a big hit. And if you're a small company, you can't handle it. So you have to merge in order to make sure you can have a big enough company to take that hit. Also today, big pharma does, so what's happened? So what has happened over the years is now, big pharma does almost all the development. The small startup firms actually do the research. When I was in the industry, every company had its own research. I mean, Upjohn prided itself on its research. That's not happening today, for the most part. For the most part. Now, the small companies have to license their drugs to big pharma because big pharma has the connections with the FDA. The little companies don't. They're new. And the FDA doesn't trust the new companies. They trust the big companies. Why? I don't. Well, I shouldn't say I don't know. I have some ideas, but I don't have data on it, so I won't say. I'll let you speculate. But so because of that, the little companies tend to have to almost sell out at a very low price to big pharma. There have been some exceptions. Some little companies have managed to get through the process, and I applaud them, but it's not typical. Okay. You know what? We might not care about the cost of drugs at the pharmacy or how long it takes to get them to market if the drugs were safer, right? But are they? After all of this, do the amendments which were passed to make drugs safer and more effective actually live up to what they want? Well, what they claimed they would be. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, no. Drugs are not safe for a number of reasons. So one way you can look at this is look at the withdrawal rate. So drugs get approved. Then some of them are found to have side effects, and they are taken off the market for safety reasons. Now, pre-amendment, there were about 2.5% of all the NCEs that were put out every year were withdrawn. So 2.5% of all the approved drugs have been pulled from the market pre-amendment. After the amendments, it was 3.3%. In other words, it went up. Well, probably not significantly. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying this is a big difference. It's probably not. But it's going in the wrong direction. This number was supposed to go down. That was the promise of the amendments. That has not happened. And another way of looking at this is look at the biggest drug disasters pre and post amendment. So thalidomide worldwide, and actually I've seen a lot of different numbers on this. I'm using the largest numbers that I saw. Okay, between 50,000 and 80,000 deformities, miscarriages, and deaths. I used to use the 10% or 10,000 number for the number of deformities. So most of these others are miscarriages and deaths, if these numbers are right. I've seen them. I haven't looked to validate them to make sure they're correct, but I'm using the high numbers just so you can kind of get a feel of how bad it might have been. Now, with Vioxx was put on the market after the amendments. And by the FDA's own admission, they think maybe 60,000 deaths and 140,000 heart attacks. But this is probably a really low estimate. Other estimates I've seen, which make more sense to me, is 1.3 million, because this drug was widely used. It was waited for a long time. It was widely used. But whatever these numbers were, Vioxx shouldn't have happened. And actually, the FDA knew that it was going to cause heart attacks before they approved it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, other than the FDA not doing what it should, why do unsafe drugs get to market in the first place? How come, even after the amendments, we had significant numbers of bad drugs getting to market? Well, okay, in the 1950s, most of the problems, safety problems I'm talking about, were due to the fact that we just didn't have good enough science. And so we didn't predict reactions in specific populations. So for example, this didn't happen in the US, but it did happen in Europe. It wasn't widely appreciated that the fetus was so sensitive to drugs that the mother took, which were perfectly safe for her. So that's one thing. And actually today, it's pretty much the same thing. You know, we try to eliminate a lot of these things, but we can't, because we can't predict everything with animal safety studies or even human safety studies, because there's a big difference between doing a study with thousands of people and putting it on the market for millions to take. There's going to be some people who don't react well to every drug. It's just the way life is. At this stage of the game, we can't predict it. And it's interesting because while I'm telling you that the safety problems we see today, except for Vioxx, which I'll talk about in a minute, have similar issues, I also want to mention that there's this little glitchy thing going on with the way the studies are done. Remember, we talked earlier about the fact that you had to get statistical significance for drugs, and sometimes they can be statistically significant and clinically insignificant. And if you heard my other panelist on Sunday, Rob Whitaker, talking, and he's going to talk, I think it's this coming weekend, I'm sorry. He talked about how this is the case for psychiatric drugs. So I think that's actually right on from what I know, and I'm not an expert in that, so I'm going to defer to him. He's the expert. But this is another issue that's coming up, is that we have things that are not clinically significant but statistically significant, and some of these have some serious side effects. So there's a number of issues.